The Barrett M82 lay abandoned in the dust like a discarded promise, its bipod legs splayed at unnatural angles where Sergeant Rodriguez had dropped it 3 minutes before the shrapnel found his chest. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen crouched behind the concrete barrier, her logistics uniform soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the 118-degree Afghan heat. The rifle's distinctive muzzle brake caught fragments of sunlight, throwing geometric shadows across her mud-caked boots as she calculated distances, ammunition counts, and the rapidly shrinking window of opportunity that separated her convoy from complete annihilation. 27 trucks sat motionless on the mountain road below, their diesel engines ticking in the oppressive silence that followed firefights. Each vehicle carried enough medical supplies to sustain a field hospital for 6 months, enough ammunition to arm 2 companies, and enough hope to keep the forward operating bases running through the winter. Maya's clipboard, now torn and bloodstained, contained the manifest that represented 3 months of her meticulous planning. Every serial number memorized, every requisition form filed in triplicate, every logistical nightmare solved with the kind of precision that had earned her commendations and the quiet respect of officers who never bothered learning her first name. The insurgents had positioned themselves with tactical brilliance across the ridgeline, their AK-47s and RPGs creating an overlapping field of fire that turned the narrow mountain pass into a killing funnel. Maya's radio crackled with desperate reports from the convoy's scattered defenders. "Taking heavy fire from the north slope. Need immediate extraction. We've got wounded." The voices belonged to soldiers she'd shared coffee with that morning, men and women who trusted her route planning, her intelligence assessments, her promise that this road was safe. Private Williams, barely 19, and still writing letters to his girlfriend in Nebraska, pressed himself against the opposite side of the barrier. His M4 carbine trembled in his grip, the weapon's familiar weight suddenly feeling inadequate against the enemy's superior positioning. "Staff Sergeant, what do we do?" His voice carried the particular strain of someone discovering that courage and good intentions weren't always enough to survive the random mathematics of combat. Maya's mind processed the tactical situation with the same systematic approach she applied to supply chain management. 300 meters to the enemy positions. No air support available for another 40 minutes. Limited ammunition. Wounded soldiers requiring immediate evacuation. The Barrett 50 caliber rifle represented their only long-range option, its massive rounds capable of penetrating cover that would stop smaller calibers. But the weapon was alien to her, a tool of precision killing that had no place in her world of spreadsheets and shipping containers. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn toward Corporal Jackson, the convoy's senior medic, who half-carried, half-dragged Torres toward their position. Torres's left leg hung at an impossible angle, bone visible through the torn fabric of his combat uniform. Jackson's medical bag bounced against his hip with each labored step, its contents representing the difference between life and death for the wounded scattered across the mountainside. "I can stabilize him, but we need to get out of here," Jackson gasped, lowering Torres behind the barrier with practiced gentleness. His hands worked automatically, applying pressure bandages and preparing morphine while his eyes remained fixed on Maya's face. In that look, she recognized the weight of command that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the moment when someone had to make decisions that others would live or die by. The Barrett rifle seemed to grow heavier as she stared at it, its weight measured not in pounds, but in the accumulated training she'd never received, the muscle memory she'd never developed, the confidence she'd never been asked to build. Maya knew the weapon's specifications. She'd processed its requisition forms, tracked its shipping manifests, calculated its replacement costs. The M82 fired .50 BMG rounds at 2,800 feet per second with effective range exceeding 1,500 meters. In her world of logistics, it was inventory item NSN 1005-01-134-9241, requiring specific cleaning kits, specialized storage, and trained operators with security clearances. But here, in this moment suspended between order and chaos, the rifle represented something entirely different. It was the difference between watching her soldiers die from inadequate range and taking action that might save them. It was the bridge between the carefully controlled world where she excelled and the brutal immediacy of combat, where hesitation measured in seconds could determine who returned home and who didn't.
Private Williams's radio buzzed with another desperate transmission. "This is Alpha 6. We have multiple wounded and are taking heavy fire. Request immediate." The transmission dissolved into static as enemy fire found another communication device. Another voice silenced in the growing catalog of things going wrong. Maya's hands moved toward Barrett before her conscious mind approved the decision. The rifle's grip felt alien against her palm, its weight distributed differently than the M16 she had qualified with annually but rarely fired outside the controlled environment of the shooting range. The weapon's scope, a Leupold Mark IV with ballistic reticle, revealed a world of precise violence that her logistics training had never prepared her for. Through the magnified optics, she could see individual faces among the enemy positions, young men with determined expressions, older fighters with the patient stillness of experienced guerrillas, all of them unified by their commitment to stopping her convoy and claiming its valuable cargo. The scope's crosshairs wavered across targets that weren't inventory numbers or shipping estimates, but human beings with families, beliefs, and reasons for fighting that she couldn't begin to understand. Corporal Jackson finished his initial treatment of Torres and looked up at Maya with expectation that felt heavier than the rifle in her hands. "Staff Sergeant, we need covering fire to get the wounded out. That Barrett is our only option for reaching their positions." The mountain wind carried the smell of cordite and dust, mixing with the metallic taste of fear that coated Maya's mouth like copper pennies. Somewhere below, engines continued their mechanical cooling, oblivious to the human drama playing out on the rocks above. Her convoy represented months of work, thousands of hours spent coordinating with suppliers, negotiating with contractors, solving problems that existed only on computer screens and shipping manifests. But the soldiers scattered across the mountainside weren't in inventory. They were Specialist Martinez, who sent half his paycheck home to his mother in San Antonio. Private Johnson, who carried pictures of twin daughters he'd never met. Sergeant Thompson, who'd volunteered for a second deployment because his unit needed experienced leadership. Each name represented a family, a future, a collection of dreams that Maya had somehow become responsible for protecting. The Barrett's safety clicked off with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the relative quiet between enemy volleys. Maya's breathing steadied as she settled into a prone firing position, the rifle stock pressed against her shoulder with the kind of deliberate placement she learned from training manuals rather than experience. The scope revealed details that her logistics background had taught her to catalog. Muzzle flashes indicating position and weapon type, movement patterns suggesting coordination and experience, tactical arrangements that spoke of planning and local knowledge. Her first shot would announce her position and commit her to a course of action that couldn't be undone. Barrett's massive rounds would draw enemy attention, making her a priority target for fighters who understood the threat that precision fire represented to their tactical advantage. But in the scope's reticle, she could also see the path to salvation. Key positions whose elimination would allow her convoy to break contact and complete the mission that had brought them into this killing ground. Corporal Jackson watched her preparations with the intensity of someone whose life depended on her accuracy. "Staff Sergeant, do you know how to use that thing?" Maya's finger found the trigger as she centered the crosshairs on her first target, a machine gun position that commanded the entire road. "I'm about to find out." Maya's world had always been measured in precise increments, delivery schedules calculated to the hour, inventory levels monitored to the single unit, fuel consumption predicted within percentage points that made the difference between mission success and logistical failure. Her daily routine at Forward Operating Base Shepherd began each morning at 0445, 30 minutes before Reveille, when she would review overnight cable traffic while drinking coffee from a mug emblazoned with her logistics unit's motto, "Professionals in logistics move the world."
The coffee ritual represented more than caffeine addiction. It was her anchor point in a deployment where chaos constantly threatened to overwhelm careful planning. She would sit at her desk in the Logistics Operations Center, surrounded by whiteboards covered in shipping schedules, convoy routes, and supply forecasts that transformed the abstract violence of counterinsurgency warfare into manageable spreadsheet cells. Each row represented a mission, each column a variable to be controlled, each formula a solution to problems that other people created and expected her to solve. Her laptop screen displayed the kind of organized complexity that had made her indispensable. Real-time tracking of 847 different supply categories, automated reorder points for everything from medical supplies to rifle cleaning kits, predictive algorithms that anticipated demand spikes based on operational tempo and seasonal weather patterns. Maya had built these systems herself, teaching herself programming languages and database management during off-duty hours because the military's standard logistics software couldn't handle the intricacies of sustained combat operations in Afghanistan's unforgiving geography. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander, had stopped trying to understand her methods after her third month in country, when her efficiency ratings began exceeding anything in his previous experience. "Chen, I don't care if you're using witchcraft as long as you keep my soldiers supplied," he'd told her during a morning briefing, the kind of backhanded compliment that acknowledged her competence while maintaining the comfortable fiction that logistics was somehow less important than the direct action missions that made headlines. But Maya understood what others missed. Every bullet fired in anger, every bandage applied to wounded soldiers, every hot meal served in forward positions existed because someone had calculated its need, arranged its transportation, and solved the thousand small problems that stood between intention and execution. Her world was invisible to most soldiers, the critical foundation that they noticed only when it failed. The morning of the convoy mission had begun with her standard routine, but an email marked priority from division headquarters had disrupted her carefully planned day. The message contained new intelligence about improvised explosive device threats along their planned route, forcing Maya to recalculate approach vectors, adjust convoy spacing, and modify timing to minimize exposure windows. She'd spent 3 hours rebuilding the entire mission profile, cross-referencing enemy activity reports with terrain analysis and weather forecasts to create a route that balanced speed with security. Captain Rodriguez, the convoy's military police commander, had reviewed her plan with the professional skepticism that combat arms officers typically reserved for logistics personnel. "This route adds 40 minutes to our travel time, Staff Sergeant. My soldiers don't like being sitting ducks any longer than necessary." Maya had pulled up satellite imagery on her workstation, pointing to specific terrain features with the laser pointer she'd inherited from her predecessor. "Sir, the additional time trades against reduced exposure to known IED emplacements here and here. The mountain pass offers better visibility, harder concealment for enemy observers, and multiple exgress routes if we need to break contact." Rodriguez had studied the imagery with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding ground truth. His combat experience gave weight to his questions, but Maya's analytical approach had identified patterns that experience alone might miss. "What's your confidence level on this route assessment, Chen?" 87%, sir, based on enemy activity patterns over the past 6 months, IED placement preferences, and seasonal movement indicators. Maya's precision with numbers reflected her fundamental belief that uncertainty could be measured, quantified, and managed through careful analysis. She'd never fired a shot in anger, never felt the particular terror of incoming rounds, never experienced the way careful planning could dissolve under the chaos of actual combat. The convoy's departure had proceeded exactly according to her timeline. 27 vehicles loaded according to her weight distribution calculations, crews briefed on her route selections, contingency plans prepared for the most likely failure modes her analysis had identified. Maya rode in the convoy commander's vehicle, her laptop open to real-time tracking displays that showed each truck's position, speed, and estimated arrival time at key waypoints along their journey. Her role should have been purely supervisory. monitor communications, adjust timing if necessary, coordinate with base operations for any changes in mission parameters. But the landscape scrolling past her window carried implications that her spreadsheets couldn't capture.
The mountains rose in harsh beauty around their convoy, their rocky faces scarred by centuries of conflict between various armies and local fires who understood that controlling the high ground meant controlling everything that moved through the valleys below. Maya's personal history had never included the kind of childhood that prepared girls for military service. Growing up in Sacramento as the daughter of immigrant parents, her world had been defined by academic achievement, family expectations, and the particular pressure that came with being the first in her family to attend college. Mathematics had been her sanctuary, a realm where hard work and careful thinking always produced correct answers, where problems had solutions that could be verified and replicated. Her decision to join the Army had surprised everyone, including herself. The recruiter had emphasized educational benefits and career training, painting military service as an extension of her academic interests rather than the violent profession that it ultimately was. The logistics field had seemed like a perfect fit, organized, technical, intellectually challenging work that happened to take place in uniform, but felt fundamentally similar to the supply chain management courses she'd excelled at during her business administration studies. Basic training had been her first encounter with the military's violent core, but even there, the weapons training felt more like technical education than preparation for killing. She'd qualified as an expert with the M16 rifle, memorizing sight pictures and breathing techniques with the same methodical approach she applied to learning new software applications. The targets were paper silhouettes at known distances, the environment controlled, the stakes limited to qualification scores rather than human lives. Advanced individual training for logistics specialists had reinforced her sense that military service could be intellectually demanding without being morally compromising. Her instructors had been former supply sergeants who spoke about their deployment experiences in terms of tonnage moved, deadlines met, and problems solved. Combat was something that happened to other people, while logistics professionals worked in the relative safety of rear-echelon positions, where the most dangerous equipment was forklift trucks and industrial printers. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had initially confirmed these expectations. Forward Operating Base Shepherd was a small city of prefabricated buildings, concrete walls, and air-conditioned facilities that felt more like an industrial complex than a combat outpost. Maya's office was climate-controlled, networked to databases in the United States, equipped with the same productivity software she might have used in a civilian supply chain management position. But gradually, the deployment's reality had begun penetrating her controlled environment. The helicopters that arrived with wounded soldiers, their medical equipment stained with blood that her manifests had tracked from manufacturing facilities in North Carolina. The memorial services for soldiers killed by IEDs planted along roads that she'd helped select based on her route analysis. The quiet moments when experienced soldiers would discuss friends lost to sniper fire, ambushes, or the countless random ways that warfare found even the most careful people. Maya had responded to these glimpses of combat's reality by working harder, refining her systems, improving her accuracy, as if perfect logistics could somehow protect the soldiers who depended on her planning. She developed personal relationships with many of the soldiers her supplies supported, learning their names, remembering their preferences, tracking their requests with the kind of individual attention that transformed her from an anonymous staff function into someone who cared about their welfare. Private Williams had been one of those soldiers, a young man from Nebraska whose letters home often mentioned the logistics staff sergeant who somehow always managed to get his favorite energy bars included in care packages. Specialist Torres had written commendations for her efficiency after she'd arranged emergency delivery of specialized medical equipment for his diabetic daughter's care package. Sergeant Rodriguez had nominated her for an Army Commendation Medal based on her development of predictive maintenance programs that had prevented dozens of vehicle breakdowns. These relationships had given human faces to her statistical analyses, transforming supply requirements from abstract numbers into personal responsibilities. Maya had begun thinking of her soldiers not as consumers of logistics services, but as individuals whose lives depended on
her competence. The weight of that responsibility had motivated her to work longer hours, study additional technical manuals, and develop backup systems for every critical process. But nothing in her training, education, or deployment experience had prepared her for the moment when logistics planning became inadequate, when spreadsheets couldn't solve the problem, when the only tool that mattered was a weapon she'd never been trained to use in circumstances she'd never been taught to handle. The Barrett rifle's weight against her shoulder represented the complete failure of everything she'd believed about her role, her capabilities, and her place in the military structure. She was a logistics officer who'd wandered into a gunfighter's world, carrying a weapon designed for specialists she'd never been trained to become. But the soldiers depending on her didn't care about her qualifications or comfort zones. They needed someone to pick up the rifle and use it, regardless of whether that someone was prepared for the responsibility. Maya's breathing steadied as she settled into the weapon's controls, her analytical mind automatically cataloging the scope's reticle system, the trigger's weight, the bipod's stability against the rocky ground. These were technical specifications that could be learned, variables that could be managed, problems that could be solved through careful application of principles she understood. The human cost of missing, the moral weight of shooting, the responsibility of taking lives to save lives, these were calculations her spreadsheets had never been designed to handle. The first shot erupted from the Barrett with a violence that Maya's body wasn't prepared to absorb. The rifle's massive recoil drove into her shoulder like a physical blow, its concussion rolling across the mountainside with the deep-throated roar that announced the presence of American firepower. Through the scope, she watched her target, an enemy machine gunner positioned behind a rock outcropping, disappear in a spray of stone fragments and dust as the .50 caliber round found its mark. The immediate silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond normal time, as if the mountain itself was processing the implications of what had just occurred. Then chaos erupted across the ridgeline as enemy fighters scrambled to identify this new threat, their disciplined ambush formation dissolving into confused movement as they realized that someone was shooting back with precision and devastating effect. Maya worked the Barrett's bolt with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent brass that tumbled away across the rocks with a metallic ringing that sounded like dropped coins. Her hands moved through the reloading sequence with muscle memory borrowed from countless hours of training that had never seemed relevant to her logistics responsibilities. But the weapon's operation was simply another system to master, another set of procedures to execute correctly under pressure. Her second target was an RPG gunner who'd been preparing to engage the convoy's lead vehicle. The scope revealed him in intimate detail, a bearded man in his 30s, wearing a pockle hat and carrying himself with the confidence of someone experienced in mountain warfare. Maya's crosshairs centered on his chest as she calculated wind drift, bullet drop, and the fractional adjustments that would determine whether her shot connected or missed entirely. Barrett spoke again, its muzzle blast kicking up dust and small stones around Maya's position. Through the scope, she watched her target, an enemy fighter, fold backward as if struck by an invisible hammer, his RPG launcher tumbling away down the rocky slope. The sight should have been horrifying, but Maya found herself feeling only a cold satisfaction that her calculations had proven accurate, that the technical aspects of long-range shooting were yielding to systematic application of ballistic principles. Private Williams crouched beside her, serving as spotter with his rifle's optic sight trained on the enemy positions. "Jesus, Staff Sergeant, where did you learn to shoot like that?" His voice carried amazement mixed with something approaching reverence, as if Maya had revealed capabilities that fundamentally altered his understanding of who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. "I didn't," Maya replied, working the bolt and scanning for her next target. "I'm figuring it out as I go." The admission should have been terrifying, but instead it felt liberating. For the first time in her military career, she was working without manuals, without standard operating procedures, without the carefully structured systems that had defined her professional identity. She was solving problems in real time using nothing but analytical thinking and the weapon in her hands. The enemy's return fire began reaching their position with increasing accuracy as the fighters identified Maya's location from her muzzle flashes. AK-47 rounds cracked overhead with their distinctive supersonic snap, followed by the heavier reports of the rifles that had fired them. Chips of concrete flew from the barrier as bullets found its edges, filling the air with dust and fragments that stung exposed skin. Corporal Jackson had finished stabilizing Specialist Torres and was treating 2 additional wounded soldiers who'd been carried to their position by other members of the convoy. His medical skills were being tested by wounds that ranged from superficial shrapnel cuts to serious trauma that required immediate surgical intervention. "I need to get these guys to a medical facility, Staff Sergeant. How long can you keep their heads down?" Maya's third shot took out an enemy fighter who'd been trying to flank their position, his body tumbling down the rocky slope in a cascade of loose stones and dust. Barrett's scope revealed at least a dozen additional targets distributed across multiple positions, each one representing a tactical problem that needed to be solved before her convoy could safely extract from the ambush site. "I can buy you time, but we need to coordinate the withdrawal," Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Williams, get on the radio and tell everyone to be ready to move on my signal. Jackson, how long do you need to prepare the wounded for transport?" The medic glanced at his patients with the quick assessment that separated competent corpsmen from merely adequate ones. 5 minutes if I can work without taking fire, longer if I have to keep ducking bullets every few seconds. Maya nodded, settling back behind Barrett's scope with renewed focus. Her 4th and 5th shots eliminated 2 enemy positions in rapid succession, the massive rounds punching through cover that would have stopped smaller calibers. Each successful engagement reduced the enemy's effective fire, creating space for Jackson to work and buying precious minutes for the convoy's extraction. But Maya was also learning the tactical realities that her logistics training had never addressed. Every muzzle flash from her position revealed her location to enemy observers, making her a priority target for fighters who understood that eliminating the Barrett would restore their tactical advantage. Counter-sniper fire was beginning to probe her position with increasing accuracy, forcing her to shoot and immediately relocate to avoid return fire. The weight of the Barrett made these movements awkward and time-consuming. Maya found herself cursing the weapon's bulk as she low-crawled between firing positions, dragging the rifle's considerable mass across rocks that seemed designed to snag equipment in slow movement. Her logistics uniform, optimized for air-conditioned offices rather than combat operations, began tearing on sharp stones and thorny vegetation. Private Williams stayed with her, serving as both spotter and security as they moved between positions. His M4 carbine provided short-range defensive capability while Maya engaged targets at distances where her rifle was most effective. The partnership developed organically, without formal communication or predetermined roles, as both soldiers adapted to circumstances that neither had been specifically trained to handle. "Contact left," Williams shouted, his rifle chattering in short, controlled bursts as enemy fighters attempted to close the distance to their position. Maya swung the Barrett toward the new threat. Its scope revealed 3 men armed with AK-47s who were bounding between rock formations in a coordinated assault on their defensive position.
Barrett's next shot caught the lead fighter's center mass, dropping him instantly and causing his companions to dive for cover behind inadequate terrain. Maya's follow-up shot punched through the rocks sheltering the second fighter, the .50 caliber round's massive energy proving that his concealment wasn't actually cover against her weapon system. The third fighter broke contact and withdrew toward the main enemy position, his retreat covered by suppressive fire from multiple locations along the ridgeline. Maya noted his movement patterns and equipment, filing away tactical intelligence that might prove useful if the engagement continued. But her primary focus remained on creating enough space for the convoy's extraction, using precision fire to disrupt enemy coordination rather than attempting to eliminate every threat.
Jackson waved from his position beside the wounded soldiers, indicating that his medical preparations were complete. The casualties have been stabilized for transport, their bleeding controlled, and airways secured for the evacuation that would determine whether they lived or died. Torres, the most seriously wounded, remained conscious but pale, his eyes fixed on Maya with a particular intensity of someone whose survival depended on her continued success with the Barrett rifle. "Convoy's ready to move, Staff Sergeant," Williams reported, his radio crackling with confirmations from the truck drivers who'd been waiting for the signal to begin their escape from the ambush site. The vehicle's engines revved in sequence, their diesel exhaust creating clouds of black smoke that would help conceal their movement, but also announce their intentions to every enemy observer on the mountain. Maya's scope swept across the remaining enemy positions, identifying targets that posed the greatest threat to the convoy's withdrawal route. Her next 3 shots eliminated a machine gun team that commanded the road's initial turn, their position dissolving under Barrett's devastating impact. The weapon's power was intoxicating. Each successful shot represented problems solved, threats eliminated, soldiers saved through the application of precise violence. But Maya was also discovering the weapon's limitations. The Barrett's weight and bulk made rapid target engagement difficult, especially when switching between widely separated positions. Its massive muzzle signature revealed her location with each shot, requiring constant movement to avoid counter-battery fire. Most importantly, her ammunition supply was limited to whatever rounds Rodriguez had been carrying when he'd been wounded, perhaps 30 rounds total, for an engagement that could easily consume twice that number. The convoy began moving in carefully coordinated bounds, each vehicle accelerating through the most dangerous sections of road while Maya provided overwatch with the Barrett. Her shots were becoming more selective, focused on threats that directly endangered the convoy's withdrawal route, rather than attempting to suppress every enemy position. Conservation of ammunition was becoming as important as accuracy, each round representing multiple potential lives saved or lost based on her targeting decisions. Enemy mortar fire began falling around the convoy's route, the rounds impacting in geysers of dirt and stone that showered the vehicles with fragments. Maya watched through her scope as the enemy forward observer adjusted his calls for fire, walking the impacts closer to the slow-moving trucks with each successive volley. The mortar team became her priority target, its elimination critical to the convoy's survival. But locating indirect fire positions required different skills than engaging direct-fire weapons. Maya found herself studying muzzle flashes, backplotting trajectory angles, and using terrain analysis to identify likely firing positions, skills that belong more to artillery officers than logistics personnel. Her scope swept across potential locations, searching for the telltale signs of concealed mortars, while enemy rounds continued falling uncomfortably close to her soldiers. Williams spotted them first, his younger eyes catching movement in a depression that Maya's systematic search had missed. 2 o'clock, about 800 meters, behind that cluster of boulders, he called, his voice tight with urgency, as another mortar round impacted near the convoy's rear guard. Maya shifted the Barrett toward Williams' indicated target area, the scope revealing a 2-man mortar team in the process of loading another round. The range was at the edge of her comfort zone, requiring precise calculation of bullet drop and wind drift for a successful engagement. But the alternative was watching helplessly as indirect fire destroyed vehicles and killed soldiers who trusted her planning and leadership. Her shot struck the mortar tube directly, the .50 caliber round's impact causing secondary explosions as stored ammunition detonated in a fireball that engulfed both enemy soldiers. The dramatic result surprised Maya, who'd aimed for the crew rather than their equipment, but the outcome was tactically perfect, eliminating both the immediate threat and preventing future use of that particular firing position. The convoy's lead elements were clearing the initial danger area,
their movement protected by Maya's systematic elimination of enemy positions along the route. But new threats were emerging as the engagement evolved, enemy reinforcements moving into positions that commanded later sections of the road. Maya realized that her successful overwatch was only postponing rather than solving the tactical problem. Eventually, she would run out of ammunition, the enemy would adapt to her capabilities, or additional threats would emerge that exceeded her ability to address.
Jackson was loading the wounded into vehicles that had stopped long enough to collect casualties, his medical training evident in the speed and efficiency of his patient movement. But each second the convoy remained stationary increased their vulnerability to enemy fire, creating tension between medical necessity and tactical survival that had no perfect solution. "Staff Sergeant, we need to move," Williams urged, his rifle providing security as Maya prepared to displace from their current position. The Barrett's weight seemed to have doubled during the engagement, its bulk now representing the difference between mobility and becoming a fixed target for enemy counter-sniper operations. Maya fired 2 final shots at enemy positions that threatened the convoy's rear guard, then began the awkward process of moving with the heavy rifle toward their next defensive position. Her logistics background had never included training on tactical movement with crew-served weapons, leaving her to improvise techniques for managing the Barrett's weight and bulk across terrain that seemed designed to punish anyone carrying more than basic infantry equipment. The convoy's successful extraction would depend on her ability to maintain effective fire during movement, providing continuous overwatch while simultaneously relocating to positions that offered tactical advantage. It was a complex coordination problem that combined technical shooting skills with tactical movement and strategic timing, exactly the kind of multivariable challenge that Maya's analytical mind was designed to solve, even when the stakes were measured in human lives rather than shipping schedules. The convoy's extraction proceeded with the mechanical precision that Maya's planning had envisioned, but the reality unfolding around her bore no resemblance to the neat arrows and timing sequences she'd drawn on her operational graphics. Vehicles moved in stuttering advances between positions that offered momentary concealment, their progress measured not in miles per hour, but in the spaces between enemy volleys, the brief windows when accurate fire was possible, the precious seconds when wounded soldiers could be loaded without exposing medics to sniper fire. Maya had established overwatch from a rocky outcropping that commanded the road's most dangerous section, where the mountain pass narrowed to force traffic through a corridor barely wide enough for military trucks. Barrett's scope revealed the convoy's vulnerability with crystal clarity. 27 vehicles strung out across nearly a mile of winding road, each one representing months of her logistical planning and dozens of soldiers whose survival depended on her ability to suppress enemy fire long enough for them to escape the killing ground. But something had changed in the enemy's tactics during the convoy's movement. The random, poorly coordinated fire that had characterized the initial ambush was being replaced by systematic, disciplined engagement of specific targets. Maya watched through her scope as enemy teams coordinated their movements, established interlocking fields of fire, and demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training rather than the guerrilla opportunism that American forces had grown accustomed to fighting. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over Maya's radio with the particular urgency that indicated serious problems developing faster than solutions could be implemented. "Overwatch, this is Convoy 6. We have multiple vehicles disabled by accurate fire, casualties mounting, and enemy reinforcements moving to cut off our withdrawal route. Request immediate close air support." Maya keyed her radio while maintaining her scope picture on potential targets, her voice steady despite the deteriorating tactical situation. "Convoy 6, Overwatch. Air support is not available for another 30 minutes minimum. I can provide precision fires, but I need your vehicles to coordinate movements so I don't risk blue-on-blue engagement." The response came from Lieutenant Rodriguez, the convoy's assistant commander, whose vehicle had taken an RPG hit that left him with a concussion and bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds. "Overwatch, we're taking fire from at least 6 different positions. My guys are pinned down and can't move without cover. Can you eliminate those positions?" Through her scope, Maya could identify the enemy positions that Rodriguez was reporting, but she was also seeing tactical developments that the convoy's personnel couldn't observe from their ground-level perspective. Enemy teams were moving through concealed routes toward positions that would allow them to engage the convoy's flanks and rear, transforming what begun as a hasty ambush into a coordinated attack designed to destroy the entire American force. Her next shot eliminated an enemy sniper who'd been engaging the convoy's lead vehicle with devastating accuracy, the .50 caliber round impacting with sufficient force to scatter the concealed position's carefully arranged camouflage. But Maya was learning that successful precision fire created its own tactical problems. Each engagement revealed her position to enemy observers, drew counter-sniper fire that forced immediate relocation, and consumed ammunition that couldn't be replaced until the convoy reached friendly territory. Private Williams had evolved from simple spotter into Maya's tactical partner, his infantry training providing capabilities that complemented her technical shooting skills. While Maya engaged long-range targets with the Barrett, Williams used his M4 carbine and radio to coordinate security, communicate with the convoy's dispersed elements, and provide the kind of battlefield awareness that prevented enemy infiltration of their position. Staff Sergeant, I count at least 20 enemy fighters in covered positions along the ridgeline, Williams reported, his binoculars sweeping across terrain features that Maya's scope couldn't simultaneously observe while engaging specific targets. They're moving in coordinated teams, using dead space to avoid your fires and setting up what looks like a blocking position about 200 meters ahead of the convoy's lead element. Maya shifted her scope toward the area Williams had identified, the magnified optics revealing enemy soldiers in the process of emplacing what appeared to be a heavy machine gun in a position that would command the entire road. The tactical implications were clear. If that weapon system became operational, the convoy's movement would be effectively stopped, transforming their withdrawal into a static defense against superior enemy numbers and positioning. Her shot at the machine gun position required precise calculation of range, wind drift, and bullet drop over a distance that pushed the Barrett's effective engagement envelope. Maya's logistics background had given her comfort with mathematical calculations, but applying ballistic formulas under combat stress, while enemy rounds snapped overhead, required a different kind of precision than spreadsheet accuracy. The scope's reticle wavered slightly as she controlled her breathing, centered the crosshairs, and pressed the trigger with the steady pressure that her training had emphasized. The .50 caliber round struck the enemy machine gun's receiver with devastating effect, the weapon disintegrating in a shower of metal fragments that eliminated both the crew and their equipment in a single shot. Maya allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before shifting to her next target, a process that was becoming automatic despite her lack of formal sniper training. But Maya was also discovering tactical realities that her logistics experience had never addressed. Enemy forces were adapting to her capabilities with professional competence, using smoke and movement to mask their positions, coordinating suppressive fire to limit her engagement opportunities, and systematically working to identify her location for decisive counter-battery fire. She was learning that successful sniping required constant movement, careful concealment, and tactical patience that balanced immediate threats against long-term survival. Corporal Jackson's medical section had established a casualty collection point in a natural depression that offered protection from direct fire while maintaining access to the convoy route. His triage decisions were becoming increasingly critical as wounded soldiers arrived from multiple vehicles, their injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to trauma that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from blood loss. "I need immediate medical evacuation for 3 urgent cases," Jackson reported over the radio, his voice carrying the professional calm that separated competent medics from those who became overwhelmed by the scope of trauma that modern weapons could inflict on human bodies. "But I can't get helicopters into this area while we're still under effective enemy fire."
Maya understood the tactical mathematics that Jackson was describing. Medical evacuation required secure landing zones, suppressed enemy fires, and coordination with aviation assets that were currently engaged in supporting other operations across the theater. Her precision fires could create temporary windows of opportunity, but sustaining the kind of comprehensive fire suppression that helicopter operations required was beyond the capabilities of a single rifle, regardless of its power and her growing proficiency with its operation.
The convoy's situation was deteriorating with the mathematical precision that Maya's analytical mind couldn't help but calculate. Ammunition consumption was exceeding resupply capabilities. Vehicle attrition was reducing transportation capacity below the level required to evacuate all personnel. Enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than American forces could eliminate existing threats. The tactical balance was shifting toward complete disaster unless something fundamental changed in the equation. Captain Morrison's next radio transmission confirmed Maya's assessment with brutal honesty. All stations, this is Convoy 6. We have taken 50% casualties, lost 6 vehicles to enemy fire, and are running low on ammunition for sustained defense. Request immediate reinforcement or authorization to abandon non-essential equipment and conduct emergency extraction with available transportation. Maya's scope swept across the convoy's dispersed elements, the magnified optics revealing details that transformed abstract casualty reports into personal tragedies. She could see Specialist Martinez attempting to treat his own shrapnel wounds while maintaining security for his disabled vehicle. Private Johnson dragged an unconscious soldier toward Jackson's casualty collection point, his movement hampered by his own leg wound. Sergeant Thompson coordinated defensive fires from a position that exposed him to enemy observation because effective command required accepting personal risk. Each face represented months of shared experience, professional relationships built through the daily routine of military life, personal connections that had developed during the deployment's quieter moments. Maya had processed Martinez's request for emergency leave when his father had suffered a heart attack. She'd arranged special shipping for Johnson's care packages to his twin daughters. She'd worked with Thompson to streamline his unit's supply procedures, respecting his experience while improving efficiency through better documentation. But Maya was also experiencing something that her logistics training had never addressed: the particular responsibility that came with possessing capabilities that others lacked in life-or-death situations. The Barrett rifle represented the convoy's most effective long-range weapon system. Her growing proficiency with its operation, their best hope for suppressing enemy fires long enough to complete extraction. The weight of that responsibility was becoming as heavy as the weapon itself. Williams spotted new enemy movement on the convoy's eastern flank, his infantry training identifying tactical patterns that suggested a coordinated assault on their most vulnerable positions. Staff Sergeant, they're massing for a major attack. I count at least 30 fighters moving through dead space toward our casualty collection point. If they overrun Jackson's position, we lose our wounded. Maya shifted the Barrett toward Williams' indicated target area, her scope revealing enemy soldiers moving with the disciplined coordination that indicated formal military training rather than guerrilla improvisation. Their equipment was uniformly excellent: modern assault rifles, professional-grade optical sights, body armor that suggested state sponsorship rather than local procurement. This wasn't the random collection of insurgent fighters that intelligence briefings had led her to expect. Her next series of shots disrupted the enemy assault before it could achieve decisive concentration. Precision fires that eliminated key leaders and broke up coordinated movement. But Maya was also learning that successful defensive fires required ammunition expenditure that exceeded her available supply, forcing tactical decisions about which threats to engage and which to accept as manageable risks. Barrett's bolt locked open on an empty chamber as Maya reached for another magazine, her hands moving through reloading procedures that were becoming automatic despite their recent origin. But her ammunition supply was approaching critical levels, perhaps 10 rounds remaining from the initial load that Rodriguez had been carrying when wounded. Each shot was becoming a strategic decision that could determine whether specific soldiers lived or died.
Jackson's casualties were mounting beyond his ability to provide effective treatment with available medical supplies. Maya could see him working frantically to stabilize soldiers whose wounds exceeded the capacity of combat first aid, his professional competence hampered by equipment limitations and the impossible triage decisions that combat medicine demanded. The contradiction between his medical training's commitment to preserving life and the tactical reality that some soldiers couldn't be saved was written across his face in expressions of controlled desperation. "Overwatch, this is medical. I've got soldiers dying here who could be saved with proper surgical intervention. Can you buy me enough time to set up for emergency field surgery?" Jackson's radio transmission carried implications that Maya understood with crystalline clarity. He was asking her to suppress enemy fires comprehensively enough to allow him to attempt procedures that belonged in sterile operating rooms rather than mountainside fighting positions. Maya's response came without conscious deliberation, her voice carrying the authority that had developed during the engagement despite her lack of formal combat leadership training. "Medical, Overwatch. I can give you 15 minutes of comprehensive fire suppression, but that will consume my remaining ammunition. After that, we'll need to complete extraction with whatever resources remain available." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The next phase of Maya's engagement required different tactics than the precision shots that had characterized her earlier fires. Instead of carefully aimed shots at specific targets, she needed to create area denial through rapid, sustained fires that prevented enemy movement rather than eliminating individual threats. The Barrett's power made each round effective against multiple targets when properly placed, its massive energy creating casualty effects that extended beyond direct hits. Maya's systematic engagement of enemy positions proceeded with the methodical precision that her logistics background had trained her to apply to complex problems. Each shot was calculated to achieve maximum tactical effect, disrupting coordinated attacks, eliminating key weapon systems, creating gaps in enemy coverage that friendly forces could exploit for movement or medical treatment. But she was also learning that sustained combat operations created psychological effects that no training had prepared her to handle. The repeated cycle of target identification, precise shooting, and confirmed kills was accumulating into a weight that settled somewhere between her shoulder blades, a tension that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the moral complexity of taking human lives to save human lives. Williams maintained security and communications while Maya focused on precision fires, his role evolving into tactical coordination that kept her informed about friendly positions, enemy movements, and the constantly changing priorities that determined which targets deserved her limited ammunition. Their partnership had developed beyond formal military relationships into the kind of professional intimacy that allowed effective coordination without extensive communication. "Last magazine, Staff Sergeant," Williams announced, his observation confirming what Maya already knew but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The Barrett's power was meaningless without ammunition, its effectiveness measured ultimately by the number of rounds available rather than the weapon's inherent capabilities. She was approaching the moment when precision fires would cease to be an option, when the convoy's survival would depend on resources other than her growing proficiency with the rifle. Jackson's field surgery was proceeding under conditions that violated every principle of sterile technique. His medical training adapted to circumstances that required choosing between infection risk and immediate death from blood loss. Maya could see him working over soldiers whose names she knew, whose families she'd helped contact during previous medical emergencies, whose survival represented personal relationships that extended beyond professional obligation. Maya's final shots eliminated the enemy positions that posed the greatest immediate threat to Jackson's medical work, precision fires that bought precious minutes for surgical procedures that might determine whether specific soldiers lived long enough to reach definitive medical care. But her ammunition was exhausted, the Barrett's chamber empty, its tactical effectiveness reduced to the psychological impact of enemy uncertainty about her continued capability. The convoy's extraction would proceed without the Overwatch fires that had enabled their survival to this point. Maya gathered Barrett's weight against her shoulder and began movement toward the vehicles that represented their only remaining hope for escape from the killing ground that the mountain pass had become. Behind her, Jackson completed his emergency surgery and began loading patients for evacuation, his medical skills having bought life for soldiers who would have died without his intervention. But Maya was carrying more than Barrett's physical weight as she moved toward extraction. The engagement had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, responsibilities she'd never been trained to accept, and moral complexities that her logistics background had never addressed. She was no longer the same person who'd begun the day calculating shipping schedules and inventory levels. Her identity fundamentally altered by the discovery that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded capabilities they'd never been taught to develop. 3 weeks after the Mountain Pass engagement, Maya sat in the air-conditioned quiet of the Division Intelligence Center, watching grainy surveillance footage that showed the aftermath of what military historians were already calling the Shepherd Pass action. The drone camera's cold electronic eye revealed scattered enemy equipment, abandoned positions, and the particular emptiness that followed decisive tactical victories. But the sterile imagery couldn't capture the weight that had settled into Maya's bones during those hours when mathematical precision had determined who lived and who died. Colonel Harrison, the division commander, paused the video at a frame showing the convoy's successful extraction, 21 vehicles moving in tactical formation through terrain that should have become their gravesite. Staff Sergeant Chen, intelligence estimates indicate that your precision fires eliminated or wounded approximately 37 enemy combatants, disrupted a coordinated attack involving over 60 fires, and prevented the loss of medical supplies valued at $2.3 million. Maya nodded acknowledgement while studying her hands, which showed no visible evidence of the transformation she'd experienced. Her fingers looked identical to those that had typed supply requisitions and calculated shipping weights, but they'd also worked the Barrett's bolt, centered crosshairs on human targets, and made tactical decisions that had rippled outward into consequences she was still discovering. The disconnect between her appearance and her recent experiences felt like wearing someone else's uniform. The enemy force you engaged included foreign fighters with advanced training and equipment that exceeded anything we've encountered in this operational area, Harrison continued, advancing the surveillance footage to show close-up images of weapons and gear that intelligence analysts had been studying. Your tactical success disrupted what appears to have been a significant operation designed to interdict our supply lines and capture American personnel for propaganda purposes. The intelligence briefing included details that Maya's ground-level perspective had missed during the engagement. Enemy communications intercepts revealed the tactical shock that her precision fires had created, the disruption of carefully planned operations by capabilities they hadn't anticipated. Foreign advisors had withdrawn from the area after the engagement, their confidence in local proxy forces shaken by the demonstration that American logistics personnel could become effective combatants when circumstances required adaptation. But Maya was learning that tactical success created administrative complexities that the military's personnel systems weren't designed to handle. Her official occupational specialty remained logistics specialist, a classification that didn't include combat rules or precision shooting responsibilities. Award recommendations required careful language that described her actions without explicitly acknowledging that she'd performed duties outside her authorized training and assignment parameters. Captain Rodriguez had recovered from his wounds sufficiently to participate in the after-action review, his medical clearance allowing him to describe Maya's performance from the perspective of someone whose survival had depended on her tactical competence. Staff Sergeant Chen demonstrated proficiency with the M82 rifle system that exceeded anything in my previous experience with trained snipers. Her precision fires under combat conditions showed tactical understanding that can't be taught in classroom environments. The formal commendation process revealed institutional discomfort with Maya's unconventional success. Senior officers praised her initiative while privately expressing concern about logistics personnel engaging in direct combat operations. Military regulations were clear about roles and responsibilities, training requirements, and certification standards that Maya had exceeded through necessity rather than formal preparation.
Maya's personal equipment reflected her evolution from logistics specialist to combat veteran. Her standard-issue gear remained unchanged. The same uniform, the same load-bearing equipment, the same basic weapons that defined her official role. But she'd added personal purchases that reflected hard-learned lessons, improved optics for her M4 carbine, enhanced first aid supplies, tactical accessories that provided capabilities her original equipment lacked. The Barrett rifle had been returned to the unit's arms room, its serial number logged and its condition documented according to standard procedures. But Maya found herself thinking about the weapon's capabilities, studying ballistic tables during off-duty hours, researching advanced shooting techniques that had no relevance to her logistics responsibilities. The knowledge felt like a secret language that she learned but couldn't officially speak. Private Williams had been promoted to specialist and assigned to Maya's logistics section, a personnel action that gave them opportunities to work together without the artificial separation that military rank structure normally imposed. Their combat partnership had created professional relationships that transcended formal hierarchy, shared experiences that provided communication shortcuts and mutual understanding that enhanced their effectiveness in routine operations. Staff Sergeant Division is requesting an analysis of how the Shepherd Pass engagement might influence future convoy security procedures, Williams reported, delivering a message that represented the military's attempt to extract institutional lessons from individual experience. They want recommendations for training programs, equipment modifications, and tactical doctrine that could improve survivability for future operations. Maya considered the request while reviewing supply reports that represented her return to normal logistics responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same analytical skills that had made her effective with the Barrett rifle were being applied to preventing future situations where logistics personnel would need to become combatants. Her success was generating requirements for training that would reduce the likelihood that others would face similar challenges. But Maya was also discovering that combat experience created perspectives that couldn't be easily translated into training programs or institutional procedures. The particular combination of analytical thinking, technical competence, and moral clarity that had enabled her success with the Barrett couldn't be replicated through classroom instruction or standardized testing. Combat effectiveness emerged from the intersection of preparation and character under circumstances that couldn't be fully simulated. Specialist Torres had recovered from his leg wounds sufficiently to return to limited duty, his rehabilitation progressing with the determined optimism that characterized soldiers who'd survived serious trauma. Maya visited him regularly in the base medical facility, their conversations revealing the personal connections that had motivated her tactical performance during the engagement. "You know what I remember most about that day?" Torres said during one of their conversations, his voice carrying the particular intensity that accompanied discussions of shared combat experience. "It wasn't the pain from getting hit or the fear that I might die. It was hearing that Barrett rifle and knowing that someone was fighting back, that we weren't just sitting there taking it. That sound gave me hope when I didn't think I had any left." Maya understood what Torres was describing because she'd experienced the other side of that equation, the weight of responsibility that came with possessing capabilities that others needed for survival. The Barrett had been more than a weapon system. It had been the tool that transformed her from passive victim of circumstances into active agent of her soldiers' survival. The memory of that transformation remained as vivid as physical scars. Corporal Jackson had been awarded the Army Commendation Medal for his medical performance during the engagement.
his field surgery having saved soldiers who would have died without his intervention. But Maya knew that his success had depended on her ability to suppress enemy fires long enough for him to work, their interdependence representing the kind of tactical cooperation that made military units effective under combat conditions. The thing about combat medicine, Jackson explained during a conversation about their shared experience, is that you can have all the training and equipment in the world, but none of it matters if you can't work without getting shot. Your covering fire made the difference between having wounded soldiers and having dead soldiers. That's something they can't teach in medical school.
Maya was learning that combat created bonds between soldiers that transcended normal professional relationships. The shared experience of life-threatening situations generated trust and mutual respect that couldn't be replicated through training exercises or peacetime operations. Her logistics section had become more effective because its personnel understood that their administrative competence was ultimately judged by its contribution to mission success under the most demanding circumstances. The base's daily routine continued with the mechanical precision that characterized military operations, but Maya found herself noticing details that her previous experience had missed. The sounds of helicopters arriving with wounded soldiers carried different implications when she'd been personally responsible for creating some of those casualties. The memorial services for soldiers killed in action included names of people she'd tried to save their precision fires that hadn't been sufficient to prevent their deaths. Forward Operating Base Shepherd had been reinforced with additional security measures following intelligence analysis of the Shepherd Pass engagement. The enemy's tactical sophistication and equipment quality had prompted reevaluation of threat assessments throughout the operational area, leading to enhanced defensive preparations and modified patrol procedures that reflected lessons learned from Maya's combat experience. Maya's personal mail included letters from Rodriguez's family, expressing gratitude for her role in his survival and recovery. She'd also received correspondence from the families of other soldiers involved in the engagement, their words revealing how individual tactical decisions during combat rippled outward into consequences that affected people she'd never met in places she'd never visited. But Maya was also struggling with aspects of her experience that formal debriefings and award ceremonies couldn't address. The memory of centered crosshairs on human targets remained as vivid as photographs. The particular moment when her finger had pressed the trigger and transformed living people into tactical problems that had been solved through applied violence. The moral weight of those decisions felt heavier during quiet moments than it had during the immediate pressure of combat. Captain Morrison had submitted Maya for promotion to Sergeant First Class, a personnel action that recognized her tactical competence while acknowledging the leadership she demonstrated under combat conditions. The promotion would carry additional responsibilities and opportunities for advanced training that could formalize capabilities she'd developed through necessity rather than institutional preparation. The military needs people who can adapt to circumstances that weren't anticipated in their original training, Morrison explained during Maya's promotion counseling session. Your performance at Shepherd Pass demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and competence that we need from non-commissioned officers who might face similar situations in future operations. Maya accepted the promotion while understanding that it represented more than professional advancement. She was being formally recognized as someone who could handle responsibilities that extended beyond her original military occupational specialty, a versatility that made her valuable for assignments that required capabilities spanning multiple areas of expertise. The Barrett rifle remained in the arms room, but Maya had been granted access for training purposes, allowing her to maintain and develop the shooting skills that had proven tactically significant.
Her range time was officially justified as professional development for potential future assignments, but personally, it represented her commitment to being prepared for situations that her logistics training couldn't address. Maya's shooting groups at extended ranges continued improving with practice, her natural analytical abilities complementing formal instruction from Scout Sniper qualified personnel who recognized her potential for advanced training. The possibility of military occupational specialty reclassification had been discussed, but Maya remained committed to logistics work that she found intellectually satisfying and strategically important. The Shepherd Pass engagement had generated after-action reports that were being studied at military schools throughout the United States. Maya's tactical performance serving as a case study for adaptability and cross-training initiatives. Her experience was contributing to doctrine,
Development and training programs that might better prepare future soldiers for the kind of unexpected responsibilities that modern warfare often demanded. But Maya understood that her story was ultimately about more than tactical success or institutional lessons learned. It was about the discovery that ordinary people possessed extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demanded their development, that professional competence could transcend traditional boundaries when survival required adaptation, and that individual character could make strategic differences when tested under the most demanding conditions. 2 years later, the Advanced Combat Skills Training Center at Fort Benning buzzed with the controlled chaos that characterized military education at its most intensive level. Maya, now Sergeant First Class Chen, stood before a mixed class of logistics specialists, combat engineers, and military police officers whose primary occupations had never included precision shooting, but whose deployment experiences had revealed the need for expanded capabilities. The Barrett M82 is not just a rifle, Maya began, her voice carrying the authority that came from having used the weapon to save lives rather than simply understanding its technical specifications. It's a force multiplier that can transform a defensive situation into tactical advantage, but only if the operator understands both its capabilities and its limitations under combat conditions. The students represented the institutional response to lessons learned from multiple engagements where personnel had been required to perform duties outside their primary specialties. Maya's experience at Shepherd Pass had become one of several case studies that had prompted development of cross-training programs designed to create more versatile soldiers capable of adapting to unexpected circumstances. Behind Maya, the classroom's projection screen displayed satellite imagery of the mountain pass where her transformation from logistics specialist to combat veteran had occurred. The terrain looked different from this academic perspective, cleaner, more abstract, reduced to tactical graphics and lessons learned rather than the immediate reality of soldiers depending on her accuracy under fire. The key principle that students must understand, Maya continued, advancing to the next slide that showed ballistic tables and wind drift calculations, is that precision shooting under combat conditions requires different skills than range qualification or competitive target shooting. Environmental factors, time pressure, and psychological stress all affect performance in ways that can only be understood through realistic training. Specialist Johnson, one of Maya's current students, raised his hand with the tentative gesture that indicated genuine curiosity rather than challenging questions. "Sergeant, how did you know what to do when you'd never been trained as a sniper? What made you think you could be effective with a weapon system you'd never used in combat?" Maya paused before answering, remembering the weight of the Barrett against her shoulder and the particular moment when theoretical knowledge had become an immediate necessity. "I didn't know if I could be effective, but I knew that not trying meant watching my soldiers die, and that wasn't acceptable. Sometimes competence develops from the requirement to succeed rather than from formal preparation." The classroom discussion that followed revealed the complexity of translating individual experience into institutional training programs. Maya's tactical success had resulted from a unique combination of analytical thinking, technical aptitude, and moral courage that couldn't be easily replicated through standardized instruction. But elements of her approach could be taught, practiced, and developed in ways that might prepare other soldiers for similar challenges. 5 years later, Captain Maya Chen reviewed the final draft of her master's thesis, Adaptive Leadership in Combat Logistics, Lessons from Non-Traditional Warfare Scenarios, a document that had consumed her evenings and weekends during 2 years of graduate study at the Army's Command and General Staff College. The academic exercise had provided opportunities to analyze her Shepherd Pass experience through the lens of military theory and leadership doctrine. Her advisor, Colonel Peterson, had encouraged Maya to examine the broader implications of her experience beyond its tactical details. Your story represents something significant about the nature of modern warfare and the kind of adaptability that military leaders need to develop. The enemy doesn't respect occupational specialty boundaries, and neither should our professional development programs. Maya's research had revealed similar incidents throughout military history where individuals had exceeded their formal training to achieve tactical success under unexpected circumstances. But her analysis had also identified institutional barriers that prevented the military from fully capitalizing on such adaptability. Rigid personnel systems that struggled to recognize and develop capabilities that transcended traditional occupational boundaries. The thesis included recommendations for modified training programs, cross-functional education initiatives, and leadership development approaches that could better prepare military personnel for the kind of adaptive challenges that characterized contemporary operations. Maya's academic work was contributing to institutional changes that might prevent future soldiers from facing the kind of unprepared responsibility that she'd encountered at Shepherd Pass. But Captain Chen's current assignment as a logistics operations officer for a mechanized brigade involved challenges that had nothing to do with precision shooting or tactical adaptation. Her responsibilities included coordinating supply operations for 3,000 soldiers, managing equipment maintenance programs that kept armored vehicles operational, and solving the 1,000 daily problems that enabled military units to maintain readiness for deployment. Maya's combat experience informed her approach to routine logistics work in subtle but significant ways. She understood viscerally how administrative decisions affected tactical outcomes, how supply delays could create life-threatening situations, how equipment failures translated into increased risk for soldiers operating in dangerous environments. Her analytical skills had been sharpened by circumstances where mathematical precision determined who lived and who died. The Barrett rifle had become a symbol that followed Maya through subsequent assignments, her reputation as the logistics officer who picked up a Barrett, creating expectations and opportunities that had shaped her career development. Senior officers recognized her as someone who could handle unexpected responsibilities, leading to assignments that required capabilities spanning multiple functional areas. 10 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Chen stood in the Pentagon's Operations Center reviewing intelligence reports about convoy security incidents in the latest overseas deployment area. Her current position as Division-Level Logistics Operations Officer involved responsibilities that spanned multiple continents, coordination with international partners, and strategic planning that affected thousands of soldiers operating in various theaters of operation. The morning briefings included casualty reports from convoy ambushes that reminded Maya of her own experience at Shepherd Pass, tactical situations where logistics personnel had been forced to become combatants in order to complete their missions. But the military's institutional response to such challenges had evolved significantly during the decades since her transformative experience with the Barrett rifle. Current training programs included cross-functional skills development that provided logistics specialists with basic combat competencies, convoy security procedures that anticipated the kind of tactical adaptation Maya had demonstrated, and leadership preparation that emphasized versatility and problem-solving under pressure. Her experience had contributed to institutional changes that better prepared soldiers for the unexpected demands of modern warfare. Maya's personal office contained mementos from her various assignments, including a photograph of the logistics section that had served with her during the deployment that included the Shepherd Pass engagement. Private Williams, now Sergeant Major Williams, remained in contact with her through the informal networks that connected military personnel across time and distance. Their correspondence revealed how the shared experience of combat had created lasting bonds that transcended normal professional relationships. Williams had built his own career around the lessons learned during that engagement. His development as a non-commissioned officer, informed by the understanding that effective military units required personnel capable of adapting to circumstances that formal training couldn't fully anticipate. Specialist Torres had recovered completely from his wounds and completed a successful military career before transitioning to civilian employment as a logistics coordinator for a major corporation. His annual Christmas cards to Maya included updates about his family and expressions of gratitude that had remained consistent across the years since their shared experience in the mountain pass. Corporal Jackson had attended medical school after completing his military service, his experience as a combat medic having inspired pursuit of advanced medical training. His current work as an emergency physician in a trauma center drew directly from skills developed during military service, including the kind of decision-making under pressure that he demonstrated while treating wounded soldiers under fire. 15 years later, Brigadier General Maya Chen reviewed the final organizational chart for the new Adaptive Operations Command, a joint service organization designed to develop and implement training programs that prepared military personnel for the kind of cross-functional challenges that characterized modern warfare. Her appointment as the command's director represented recognition of her expertise in translating individual experience into institutional capabilities. The command's mission statement reflected lessons learned from multiple engagements where soldiers had been required to perform duties outside their primary specialties. Maya's experience at Shepherd Pass had become one of several foundational case studies that informed the organization's approach to developing versatile military professionals capable of succeeding in unpredictable operational environments. General Chen's office overlooked the training facilities where current soldiers practiced the kind of cross-functional skills that might have prevented her own unprepared encounter with combat responsibilities. The sight of logistics specialists learning basic marksmanship, medics developing tactical movement skills, and combat arms personnel studying supply chain management represented the institutional changes that her experience had helped inspire. But Maya understood that her story's significance extended beyond military applications. The fundamental lesson of adaptive capability under pressure had relevance for any organization that operated in environments where circumstances could change faster than formal preparation could anticipate. Her speaking engagements at corporate conferences and leadership development programs drew audiences who recognized the universal applicability of lessons learned under the most demanding conditions. Maya's personal relationships had been shaped by her military experience in ways that civilian friends sometimes struggled to understand. Marriage to Colonel David Martinez, a fellow veteran who'd commanded armored units during multiple deployments, provided partnership with someone who understood the particular weight that came with having made life-and-death decisions under combat conditions. Their children, now teenagers, had grown up hearing carefully edited versions of their parents' military experiences, stories that emphasized service and sacrifice while avoiding details that might glorify violence or traumatize young minds. But Maya wanted them to understand that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded their best efforts. 20 years later, the dedication ceremony for the Staff Sergeant Maya Chen Adaptive Leadership Center brought together dozens of soldiers whose careers had been influenced by training programs that traced their origins to lessons learned at Shepherd Pass. General Chen, now retired but serving as the center's first director, spoke to an audience that included senior military leaders, academic researchers, and corporate executives interested in developing adaptive capabilities within their own organizations.
The Barrett rifle that I picked up that day represented more than a weapon system. It represented the moment that I discovered that our greatest capabilities often emerge not from formal preparation, but from our willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that extend beyond our official duties, Maya told the gathered audience, her voice carrying the measured authority that had developed through decades of translating experience into institutional wisdom.
The Leadership Center's curriculum had evolved to include case studies from multiple conflicts, business scenarios that required adaptive problem-solving, and simulation exercises that tested participants' ability to succeed when faced with challenges outside their areas of expertise. Maya's experience provided the foundational philosophy, but the institution had grown to encompass broader principles of leadership development and organizational adaptability. The center's library contained Maya's personal papers, including the original after-action reports from the Shepherd Pass engagement, correspondence with family members of soldiers involved in the incident, and research documents that had contributed to military doctrine development. Future scholars would study these materials to understand how individual experiences had influenced institutional changes within large organizations. But the library also contained hundreds of similar accounts from other military personnel who'd faced comparable challenges, their stories revealing that Maya's experience was part of a larger pattern of adaptive leadership that characterized effective military service. The center's mission included identifying, studying, and teaching the principles that enabled such adaptability across different circumstances and organizational contexts. Maya's retirement had provided opportunities for reflection that active duty had never allowed. The weight of command responsibilities, the pressure of constant adaptation to changing circumstances, and the accumulated stress of making decisions that affected others' lives had been gradually replaced by the satisfaction of contributing to institutional development that might prevent future soldiers from facing unnecessary risks. 25 years later, the documentary film crew followed Maya through the mountain pass that had been the site of her transformative combat experience, their cameras capturing terrain that looked remarkably unchanged despite the decades that had passed since the engagement. Local populations had returned to their traditional activities, the scars of combat gradually erased by time and weather. Maya, now in her 70s, but still moving with the confident stride that had characterized her military bearing, paused at locations that triggered specific memories from that day, when logistics planning had proven inadequate and precision shooting had become the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The thing that people often misunderstand about combat, Maya explained to the interviewer, her words directed toward audiences who would watch the documentary in comfortable circumstances far removed from the harsh realities of warfare, is that it reveals who you really are, rather than changing who you are. The Barrett rifle didn't make me into someone different. It gave me the tool to become who I was capable of being when others needed my best effort. The documentary was part of a larger media project examining how individual actions during combat had influenced broader military doctrine and training programs. Maya's story provided one example of the principle that institutional change often originated from the experiences of people who'd been forced to exceed their formal preparation under circumstances that couldn't be anticipated or controlled. The film crew also interviewed other veterans of the Shepherd Pass engagement, now scattered across civilian careers that reflected their post-military development. Williams had become a high school principal whose leadership philosophy was informed by lessons learned during military service. Torres had built a successful logistics consulting business that helped corporations develop supply chain resilience. Jackson had founded a medical clinic that provided services in underserved communities.
Their continued friendship represented the lasting bonds that combat experience had created, relationships that transcended normal social boundaries and provided support networks that had sustained them through the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Annual reunions allowed them to maintain connections that had been forged under the most demanding circumstances any of them had ever faced. Maya's grandchildren watched the documentary with the particular fascination that young people reserved for family stories that seemed to belong to different worlds than their own experience. They struggled to reconcile the grandmother who helped with homework and attended school events with the combat veteran who'd used a high-powered rifle to save soldiers' lives under enemy fire.
But Maya wanted them to understand that extraordinary capabilities existed within ordinary people, that circumstances, rather than special training, had enabled her tactical success, and that the principles of analytical thinking, moral courage, and personal responsibility that had characterized her military service remained relevant to whatever challenges they might face in their own lives. The mountain pass had been designated as a historical site, its significance recognized through markers that describe the engagement and its influence on military training doctrine. Tour groups occasionally visited the location, their guides explaining how tactical innovation under pressure had contributed to institutional changes that affected military operations worldwide. But Maya understood that the site's real significance lay not in its historical designation, but in its representation of the moment when individual character had proven more important than formal preparation, when analytical thinking had enabled tactical adaptation, and when moral clarity had provided the foundation for decisive action under the most demanding circumstances. 30 years later, the final entry in Maya's personal journal, written on the anniversary of the Shepherd Pass engagement, reflected on the unexpected ways that a single day had influenced not only her own life, but the institutional development of military organizations worldwide. Her handwriting, now showing the effects of age, but still maintaining the precise formation that had characterized her logistics documentation, recorded thoughts that would eventually become part of the historical record. "I never intended to become a symbol of adaptive leadership or military innovation," she wrote, her words capturing the humility that had remained constant throughout her career development. "I was simply a logistics officer who found herself in circumstances that required capabilities I'd never been trained to develop. The Barrett rifle was available. My soldiers needed someone to use it effectively, and I accepted responsibility for outcomes that I couldn't guarantee, but I couldn't avoid attempting." Maya's final public speaking engagement, delivered to graduating classes at the military academy where she'd once been a student, emphasized the timeless principles that her experience had illustrated rather than the specific tactical details that had captured public attention. Her message focused on the importance of preparation, the value of analytical thinking under pressure, and the moral foundation that enabled effective leadership when circumstances exceeded formal training. The audience included young officers who would face their own unexpected challenges in whatever conflicts and circumstances defined their generation's military service. Maya's story provided one example of how individual characters could influence historical outcomes, but each of them would need to discover their own capabilities when tested under conditions that couldn't be anticipated or controlled. Maya's legacy extended beyond military applications through the leadership development programs that continued operating under the principles she'd helped establish. Corporate executives, emergency responders, healthcare professionals, and educational leaders studied her example as an illustration of adaptive capability that transcended specific professional boundaries. But Maya's personal satisfaction came from simpler sources. The letters she continued receiving from soldiers whose careers had been influenced by training programs that traced their origins to her experience,
The knowledge that institutional changes had reduced the likelihood that future military personnel would face unprepared responsibility for life and death decisions, and the understanding that her brief moment of tactical significance had contributed to larger purposes that extended far beyond individual recognition. The Barrett rifle that had been the instrument of her transformation was now displayed in the museum at the Adaptive Leadership Center, its brass nameplate describing the weapon's role in the engagement that had influenced military doctrine development. But Maya knew that the weapon itself was simply a tool. The real significance lay in the human decision to pick it up and accept responsibility for outcomes that formal preparation hadn't anticipated. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.
As Maya completed her final journal entry, she reflected on the mathematical precision that had characterized both her logistics career and her brief experience as a precision shooter. Numbers had provided the foundation for her analytical approach to problem solving, whether calculating supply requirements or computing ballistic solutions under combat conditions. But the human elements, courage, responsibility, moral clarity, had proven more important than technical competence when circumstances demanded exceptional performance. The mountain pass where her story had begun remained largely unchanged, its rocks and terrain indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded there decades earlier. But the ripple effects of that single day continued expanding through institutional changes, individual careers, and the accumulated wisdom that one person's experience had contributed to humanity's understanding of adaptive leadership under pressure. Maya's story had become larger than her individual experience, transformed into lessons that could be taught, principles that could be applied, and inspiration that could motivate others to discover their own capabilities when faced with circumstances that demanded their best efforts. The evening light filtering through her study window illuminated photographs that chronicled a lifetime of service. Images of young soldiers she'd trained, military leaders she'd influenced, and family members who'd supported her journey from logistics specialist to institutional innovator. Each photograph represented relationships that had been shaped by the understanding that individual actions could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. Maya's granddaughter, now a college student studying international relations, had chosen to write her senior thesis about the influence of individual military experiences on institutional doctrine development. Her research included interviews with her grandmother, but also with dozens of other veterans whose combat experiences had contributed to changes in training programs, leadership development, and organizational culture within military institutions. "The thing I find most interesting about your story, grandmother," the young woman had said during one of their conversations, "is how you never tried to become famous or take credit for the changes that followed. You just did what seemed necessary at the time and then spent the rest of your career helping other people learn from what you experienced." Maya had smiled at her granddaughter's observation, recognizing the wisdom that came from an outside perspective on events that had felt overwhelming when experienced firsthand. "Fame was never the point," she'd replied. "The point was making sure that future soldiers were better prepared than I was for the unexpected responsibilities that military service sometimes demands." The final chapter of Maya's memoir, published posthumously after her peaceful death at age 89, concluded with reflections that captured the essence of her philosophy about leadership, service, and human potential under pressure. "I was never supposed to be a sniper. I was a logistics officer who happened to find herself in circumstances where mathematical precision and moral courage were more important than formal training or official job descriptions. The Barrett rifle was simply the tool that circumstances provided. The real capability came from the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that I couldn't guarantee but couldn't avoid attempting. Military service taught me that extraordinary capabilities exist within ordinary people, waiting to be discovered when circumstances demand their emergence. The soldiers who served with me at Shepherd's Pass demonstrated the same principle in different ways. Medics who performed surgery under fire, drivers who maintained discipline under attack, radio operators who coordinated complex movements while wounded. Each of us discovered abilities we hadn't known we possessed because failure to do so would have meant abandoning people who depended on us. The institutional changes that followed our experience represent something larger than military doctrine or training programs. They reflect humanity's capacity to learn from individual experiences, to transform personal courage into collective wisdom, and to build systems that enable future generations to succeed when faced with challenges that previous experience couldn't fully anticipate.
Required to lead when leadership was needed represents a capability that exists within every person who is willing to discover it. The mountain pass where our story unfolded has returned to its natural quiet, its rocks and terrain indifferent to the human drama that briefly interrupted its ancient stillness. But the principles that enabled our survival, analytical thinking under pressure, moral courage in the face of uncertainty, and personal responsibility for collective outcomes, remain as relevant today as they were during those hours when mathematics determined who lived and who died. Future generations will face their own unexpected challenges, circumstances that will demand capabilities they haven't been formally trained to develop. My story suggests that such capabilities already exist within them, waiting to be discovered when circumstances make their emergence necessary. The tools may be different, the challenges may be unique, but the fundamental requirement for individual courage in service of collective welfare remains constant across time and culture. Military service provided the context for my own discovery of unexpected capabilities, but the principles apply far beyond military applications. Parents protecting their children, teachers inspiring their students, leaders solving problems that exceed their formal preparation. All of these represent variations on the same theme of individual character rising to meet circumstances that demand exceptional performance. The Barrett rifle returned to the arms room when our engagement ended, its tactical significance limited to the specific circumstances of that particular day. But the understanding that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand their best efforts, that insight has proven more durable than any weapon system, more powerful than any military doctrine, and more important than any individual recognition or institutional change. I was a logistics officer who picked up a Barrett .50 caliber rifle and helped save my soldiers' lives. The rifle made the tactical success possible, but the decision to pick it up and learn to use it effectively, that decision represents something fundamental about human nature under pressure, something that cannot be taught in classrooms but must be discovered through experience, something that defines the difference between those who accept responsibility for difficult outcomes and those who wait for someone else to solve problems that demand immediate action. May future generations discover their own capabilities when circumstances demand their emergence. May they find the courage to pick up whatever tools their situations provide. And may they understand that the difference between ordinary and extraordinary often lies not in special training or natural talent, but in the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that matter more than personal comfort or individual safety. The memoir's final page included a photograph of Maya's logistics section from her deployment. Young faces gathered around military vehicles in the harsh Afghan sunlight. Their names were listed in the caption, along with brief descriptions of their post-military careers and achievements. Each had built successful lives that reflected lessons learned during military service, their individual stories contributing to the larger narrative of how shared experience under demanding conditions had influenced their personal development. The book's dedication read, simply, "To the soldiers who served with courage they didn't know they possessed, in circumstances they never expected to face, for purposes larger than their individual concerns. Their stories continue in every person who discovers exceptional capabilities when ordinary preparation proves inadequate for extraordinary challenges." Maya's funeral service was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been influenced by her example. Former students from her training programs, military officers whose careers had been shaped by doctrine she helped develop, civilian leaders who'd applied her principles in their own organizations, and family members who'd learned from her that individual character could influence historical outcomes. The honor guard that folded the flag covering her casket included soldiers from the Adaptive Leadership Center, their presence representing the institutional legacy that had grown from her individual experience. But the ceremony's most meaningful moment came when Private Williams, now Command Sergeant Major Williams approaching his own retirement, delivered the eulogy that captured Maya's significance from the perspective of someone who'd witnessed her transformation firsthand.
Staff Sergeant Chen taught me that leadership isn't about rank or position or formal authority, Williams said, his voice carrying across the assembled mourners with the clarity that had characterized his radio communications during the Shepherd Pass engagement. Leadership is about picking up the tools that circumstances provide and using them to solve problems that matter more than personal comfort or individual safety. She showed me that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they accept responsibility for outcomes that extend beyond their official duties. The Barrett rifle made the tactical success possible, but Maya Chen made the decision to pick it up and learn to use it effectively. That decision, repeated thousands of times in different ways throughout her career, represents the essence of military service and the foundation of effective leadership in any context. She will be remembered not for the weapon she carried, but for the courage she demonstrated and the lives she influenced through her example. The cemetery where Maya was buried overlooked hills that bore no resemblance to the Afghan mountains where her story had begun. But the view reminded those present that individual actions could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate geographic and temporal boundaries. Her gravestone bore the simple inscription, "Logistics Officer, Combat Veteran, Teacher, Leader." She picked up the tools that circumstances provided. But Maya's real monument existed in the institutions she'd helped build, the people she'd influenced, and the understanding she'd contributed to humanity's knowledge about adaptive capability under pressure. The Adaptive Leadership Center continued operating under principles she'd established, its graduates carrying her lessons into organizations worldwide. Military doctrine continued reflecting insights derived from her experience, its influence shaping training programs that prepared soldiers for unexpected responsibilities. Most importantly, her story continued inspiring people who faced their own unexpected challenges, circumstances that demanded capabilities they'd never been formally trained to develop. Corporate executives dealing with unprecedented crises, teachers working with students who needed more than standard curriculum could provide, parents protecting children in dangerous circumstances, community leaders solving problems that exceeded available resources. All of these people could find encouragement in Maya's example of analytical thinking, moral courage, and personal responsibility under pressure. The Barrett rifle remained in the museum at the Adaptive Leadership Center, its display case surrounded by artifacts from other military engagements where individual actions had influenced broader outcomes. But visitors often noted that the weapon itself seemed less impressive than the story it represented. The story of an ordinary person who discovered extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demanded their emergence.
Maya Chen's legacy lived not in bronze or marble, but in the accumulated wisdom that individual experience could contribute to collective understanding, the institutional changes that could prevent future unnecessary suffering, and the inspiration that one person's courage could provide to countless others who would face their own moments when ordinary preparation proved inadequate for extraordinary challenges. The mountain pass in Afghanistan remained largely unchanged, its terrain indifferent to the human significance of events that had briefly interrupted its ancient quiet. But the ripple effects of that single day continued expanding through institutions, individuals, and ideas that would influence humanity's approach to adaptive leadership for generations yet to come. Maya's granddaughter completed her senior thesis with conclusions that captured the essence of her grandmother's contribution. Individual actions under extraordinary circumstances can influence institutional development in ways that extend beyond the immediate geographic and temporal boundaries. The key factor is not special training or natural talent, but the willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes that matter more than personal comfort or individual recognition. This principle applies across cultures, organizations, and historical periods, suggesting something fundamental about human nature when tested under the most demanding conditions.
The thesis was awarded highest honors and published in academic journals that specialized in leadership studies, organizational development, and military history. But its real significance lay in its contribution to the ongoing conversation about how individual character could influence collective outcomes, how personal courage could generate institutional wisdom, and how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded their best efforts. Maya's story had become part of the historical record, but it remained relevant to contemporary challenges because the fundamental principles it illustrated, analytical thinking under pressure, moral courage in the face of uncertainty, and personal responsibility for collective welfare, transcended specific temporal or cultural boundaries. Future generations would face their own unexpected challenges, but they could draw inspiration from the understanding that the capabilities they needed already existed within them, waiting to be discovered when circumstances made their emergence necessary. The Barrett rifle had been the tool that circumstances provided, but Maya Chen had been the person who'd picked it up and accepted responsibility for using it effectively. That combination, available tools and individual willingness to use them, represented the foundation of adaptive leadership in any context, the essence of effective service under demanding conditions, and the source of hope for humanity's ability to solve problems that exceeded previous experience or formal preparation.